It was supposed to be just another routine stop. At least, that's what these two officers thought. They saw a black woman driving alone, assumed the worst, and decided to pull her over. What started as a minor traffic stop quickly escalated. The officers, convinced they had the upper hand, spoke to her with arrogance, dismissing her rights and questioning her every move. She remained calm, but they didn't care. Moments later, they were slapping handcuffs on her wrists, completely unaware of who they were dealing with. Days later, the same officers entered a courtroom, expecting another routine case. But as they looked toward the judge's bench, their faces drained of color. Sitting before them, wearing the robe of authority, was the very woman they had humiliated and arrested. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Their confident smirks disappeared, replaced by shock and dread. Would she use her power to teach them a lesson? Would justice finally be served? The tension in the air was thick, and the officers knew there was no way out of this one. What happened next left the entire courtroom speechless. Keep watching to see how this incredible moment unfolded. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their hands clasped together as they exchanged nervous glances. They had walked into the courtroom expecting business as usual, another day, another case. But now, staring up at the judge's bench, they realized their mistake had come full circle. The woman they had disrespected, detained and treated as less than human, was now the one with the power to decide their fate. The judge, still composed and professional, met their eyes with a steady gaze. She wasn't the type to lash out or seek revenge. That wasn't who she was. But that didn't mean she had forgotten. Every word they had spoken to her during the arrest echoed in her mind. The way they had assumed she didn't belong in that neighborhood. The way they had dismissed her when she tried to assert her rights. The way they had tightened the cuffs as if she were a threat. The courtroom was silent, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. The officers sat frozen, knowing they couldn't undo what had already been done. What would she say? How would she handle this? One thing was certain, this was no ordinary trial. The judge took a deep breath, steadying herself as she looked at the officers. She had spent years working to uphold justice, believing in the very system that now placed her in this unexpected position. She had seen cases of unfair treatment before, too many to count, but this time it was personal. And yet, personal feelings had no place in a courtroom. She knew that. The officers, still shaken, avoided her gaze. They had walked into the room with the confidence of men who expected a system that always worked in their favor. Now that confidence was cracking. They couldn't ignore the irony of the situation, and for the first time, they felt the weight of accountability pressing down on them. They knew what they had done, even if they had never been forced to reflect on it before. But the judge wasn't interested in their discomfort. She was interested in the truth. As the case unfolded, details of their actions came to light. Witnesses recounted how the officers had dismissed her credentials when she tried to explain who she was. A traffic camera revealed how they had pulled her over without cause. Every piece of evidence stripped away their excuses, making it clear this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was bias. This was injustice. Still, the biggest question remained unanswered. What would the judge do next? Would she hold them accountable in a way they had never experienced before? Or would she let them walk away, unchanged, just as they had so many times before? The courtroom waited, breathless, as the tension grew thicker. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The officers sat rigid, their expressions shifting between frustration and fear. They had always felt untouchable in their uniforms, but now, stripped of their authority in this space, they felt exposed. The power dynamic had flipped, and they could feel it. The judge remained calm, but inside, her mind raced. She had spent her career believing in justice, yet here she was, faced with two men who had wielded their badges like weapons against people who looked like her. People who were judged before they even had a chance to speak. And now, for the first time, these officers were being forced to answer for their actions. The prosecution laid out the facts, each detail cutting deeper. The officers had no valid reason for the stop. They had ignored protocol. They had escalated the situation without cause. And worst of all, they had done it with a kind of confidence that came from knowing they wouldn't be questioned. Until now, whispers spread through the courtroom as the weight of the case settled on everyone watching. The officers shifted in their seats, their eyes darting toward the judge, waiting. Would she be the one to finally make them face the consequences of their actions? Would this moment change everything? The judge's gavel remained untouched. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady, her voice measured. Then, in a tone that sent chills through the room, she spoke. And what she said next would leave everyone stunned. The judge's voice was calm, but carried the weight of something unexpected. Before we proceed any further, she said, pausing for effect, there's something the court needs to know. A hush fell over the room. The officers, already tense, exchanged uneasy glances. The prosecution, the spectators, even the court staff, all leaned in slightly, waiting for what was coming next. She reached for a file beside her, her fingers grazing the edge of the folder as she carefully opened it. It turns out, she continued, locking eyes with the officers, this isn't the first time you've done this. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The officers stiffened, their faces suddenly pale. She held up documents, reports from multiple cases, complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and unlawful arrests. Pages filled with names, statements, and incidents eerily similar to what had happened to her. Cases that had been ignored, dismissed, or buried beneath red tape. Cases where no one had been in a position to hold these men accountable. Until now, the officers' confidence shattered. They had thought this would be one case, one moment they could brush past. But now their past had caught up with them. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the weight of their actions became undeniable. The judge let the silence stretch, letting the reality settle in. This isn't just about me, she finally said, her voice steady but firm. It's about every person who sat where I did and never got the chance to be heard. The courtroom wasn't just watching anymore. They were witnessing something bigger than one case. And they knew the moment of reckoning had only just begun. The weight of the moment pressed down on the officers. Their past, once hidden behind their uniforms, was now laid bare for everyone to see. They had no defense, no quick excuse to escape the truth. The courtroom was silent, waiting for the judge's next words. But instead of delivering a final judgment, she did something no one expected. She stood up. Stepping down from the bench, she walked slowly toward the officers, her heels echoing in the stillness. She wasn't angry. Anger would have been easy. Instead, there was something deeper in her expression. Disappointment. Resolve. A quiet kind of strength that made the officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. You had the power to protect and serve, she said, her voice measured. But instead, you chose to profile, to intimidate, to abuse that power. And you thought no one would ever hold you accountable. She let her words settle before continuing. But today, for the first time, you don't get to walk away without consequences. She turned back to her seat, lifting her gavel. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds both officers guilty of misconduct and civil rights violations. A gasp spread through the room. Justice was being served, and for once, the system wasn't looking the other way. But just as the officers slumped in their seats, defeated, the judge glanced down at the file once more. Something else was there, something even they didn't expect. One of the officers had a past conviction that had been quietly expunged, allowing him to continue serving despite clear violations. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line as she read the details. This wasn't just about these two men. It was about a broken system that had protected them. She set the file down and met their eyes one last time. "This case doesn't end here," she said, her voice steady. "This is just the beginning." And with that, the gavel came down. The courtroom remained still, the sound of the gavel lingering in the air. The officers sat frozen, the weight of their actions finally catching up with them. For the first time, they weren't the ones in control. They weren't the ones making the rules. And as they were escorted out, the reality of what had just happened settled in, not just for them, but for everyone watching. The judge took a deep breath, her hands resting on the bench. This moment wasn't just about justice for herself. It was about every person who had been ignored, dismissed, or silenced. It was about showing that the system, flawed as it was, still had the power to hold people accountable, if the right people were willing to fight for it.